Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Kimberly. It's great to be back here with you.
It's such a treat. And as we were talking before we began recording, I think the last time you were on was 2015. So it's been a bit.
It has been a bit. Yes. A lot has happened for both of us since then.
Well, what's funny is I was thinking back to, gosh, when would you have come to the yoga studio to lead that workshop? Do you remember?
I think that was maybe around 2013 or so, 2012,
Okay.
2013.
Okay. I was going to say 2010, but I'm not sure. So I'm sure you're right. But yes, yeah. That was so much fun. It was nice to meet you in person because I think that's the
It
only time
was.
we've actually been live together, right?
Yes. And I just loved experiencing your studio and just that you always create such beautiful spaces.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, congrats to you on your new book, Handbook for the Heartbroken. I guess at this point it's been out for a few months, so it's not new, but it's still new to us. A Woman's Path from Devastation to Rebirth. Again, so apropos for our conversation today. And so tell me a little bit about what led you to write this book and also what rebirth has looked like for you in this process.
Well, you mentioned that the last time we spoke was in 2015 when my second book came out. And right on the heels of that, I thought I was moving into more of a recovery time because writing a book is a big undertaking. And I was very wrong about that. Instead, I was propelled into what ended up being a several year journey into deep heartbreak and devastation on multiple levels in my intimate relationships, my health, my career, my finances, even just my sense of self. And the instigating event was that one evening my former fiance came home, and we had been together for just over 5 years at that point, and shared the news that he had been cheating on me. And it wasn't just one time, just with one person, it was with many people over many years. And that just I always become speechless when I try to describe what that was. It really just spliced through all the way through me and impacted everything. And it was a huge shock to me, even though now that I know the truth, I can, put the pieces together. And there's that saying that hindsight is 2020. But it really brought me not only to my knees, but all the way to the ground for some time. And then, like I said, there was another series of things for the next several years. So between 2016 and 2020. And for your question, what has rebirth looked like? I felt like my rebirth really started in 2021. And it has been a slow, quiet rebirth. And it hasn't been like a bright, flashy, like, oh, here's my comeback. But it's been more about a slow piecing together of myself and of my life, also of my work, from a place of deeper wholeness and a sense of more at homeness in myself, if that makes sense. And the one of the most beautiful fruitions of that, beyond my relationship with myself and the deep healing that I experienced in those years, is that now I'm engaged to another man who I met right around that time of the rebirth. And we're getting married next summer. And it just, not like we need, as women, not like we need a relationship to be whole, but that was one of my dreams, to have a real deep partnership with someone who is deeply kind and safe and trustworthy. So that's been just one of the biggest blessings on the other side of this all.
What were some tools or tips that you experienced during that journey, say from 16 to 20, of that really helped keep you together during a complete, I mean, as you said, like it shook me to like the ground. I mean, how devastating. And also, you have so many tools in your pocket and you taught them for years. And then yet when it comes to actually going through something like that, there's no toolkit, right?
There's not. And I was grateful to have been introduced to the psychotherapeutic model of internal family systems, which is also known as IFS. I think it was in 2014 with one of my longtime mentors in yoga and meditation. She had been training in IFS. And during one of our one on one sessions, she led me through the process. And I had such a profound experience. So I had that taste of it. And then after the betrayal with my then fiance, I had another session with her, and she really challenged me to take on IFS in a deeper way and to start doing it weekly, to really start to get to the root of what even led me to be in that relationship in the first place. So that again, I could rebuild myself and my life from this deep sense of inner cohesion and wholeness. So IFS was a huge piece of it. So much so that when I started coming out of it, out of those years, I started training in it. And now I've moved through all three levels of it. I'm certified and I integrate that work into everything that I do. So that was a huge piece. And then the second piece was just really deepening my faith and deepening my prayer. We could also say, I know a lot of people get triggered by that word from religious wounding. We could also say just inner listening and that divine communication, because at certain points there were no signposts. And any plan that I put in place would literally just blow up in my face. And I'd be left just having no clue what I was supposed to be doing, because just my normal way of operating the world was no longer working. So I had to root really deep inside to this a deeper sense of listening to just see what is the next right step.
And talk a little bit about IFS, right? Listeners, if there is a book that you would like to check out, because I'm always a book recommender, right? Is No Bad Parts. I'm sure you've read that, Sarah, and you may have others. But can you describe for our listeners who are like, what is IFS? Even though I think it's in the culture for sure, but I don't know that people quite get it other than parts work, right? And so interesting that he chose internal family systems for the title, because I don't know, I always think that that would be like, oh, for family therapy, even though it's not, right? It's not just for. And so can you tell us a little bit about that and how you found it to be so impactful? Because it sounds like it was a big part of your healing journey.
Sure. Well, like you said, it is an evolution of parts work. And the founder, Dick Schwartz, I haven't heard him say this, but I mean, one of my guesses is that why he named it internal family systems is that he was a family therapist and he was also really studied in systems work. So he was fusing the two, and he started to see that the same dynamics that happen in family therapy or that happen in families are happening inside each of us. That there's these power dynamics, there's these hierarchies, polarizations, alliances, and ultimately there's the potential for this sense of inner harmony and cohesion. So IFS is based on the premise that we are all comprised of a multiplicity of parts. And we all have the experience of saying, well, a part of me wants to go out tonight, but a part of me wants to stay in. I mean, that's a very benign example, but it can even go to the point of addictions that we struggle with. Like the part of me really wants to have this drink, and a part of me knows that I shouldn't. And there's conflict between those two parts. And the thing that brings us into therapy or that brings us to personal growth is when there's conflict between our parts, and or these usually go together when one or more of our parts have taken on an extreme role. So that can be a part that's absorbed in addiction, a part that is a really strong inner critic or really strong perfectionist or taskmaster. And IFS believes and it teaches that at their core, all of our parts have positive intentions, even when they're doing something that seems to be hurting us, like a part that's stuck in an addictive cycle. And that these parts stepped into these roles to protect us, usually when we were young, and we experience some sort of a hurt, could say a trauma with a lowercase t or a capital T, and we didn't have the resources inside of us or in our family environments or communities to help us to meet those challenges. So those parts stepped into an extreme role. And many times they don't even want to be in that role. They actually want to go back to what they were doing innately, just like all of us. We want to rest in more of who we truly are. And speaking of that, at the core of all of us is the truth of who we are, which IFS calls ourself with a capital S. So our self is our divinity and our parts are our humanity. And ultimately, we want to be self led within ourselves and in our lives. And the way to do that is to create these connections with all these different parts of ourselves so we can become this inner leader rather than having some of our parts take us over and hijack us at different times despite our best intentions.
It's a beautiful description of it. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Because it's one of those things that I've taken quite a few trainings on it, but it's quite complicated. And yet you really synthesized it so perfectly. So thank you. And again, yeah, listeners, check out No Bad Parts. But is there another book that you would recommend it for others who might be interested?
I think that's really the best overview of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really helpful resource. And to understand too that we are made up of all these parts and that sometimes certain ones are driving the bus and they don't need to. And right. So how do we acknowledge them, let them know that they're seen, but we don't need them at the wheel at the moment. Right. So I think this is such a good reminder. And especially as we think about your journey in this book. So tell us a little bit too about your journey into midlife and how that shifted you energetically, creatively, passionately. Because I know you've always been really big on women and personal growth and sharing all of your stories along the way.
I feel like the several years that I write about in this book were my initiation into midlife. So those lasted from about 38, 39 to about 42, 43. Now I'm about to turn 47. And I was grateful to have come across a new mentor during those years who really introduced me to this concept of the midlife initiation and how it's a time when we really reckon with kind of parts of ourselves, of our history, even of our ancestral lineage that have not been resolved yet, and to resolve those so that we can be living more from our true self rather than our false personality, or from an IFS perspective, we could say rather than from our parts. So I feel like those several years and that deep inner work that I was doing, both spiritually through deep inner listening and the trauma healing with IFS, really brought me into this space. And when I came out, actually, I'll back up a little bit. During portions of that, I thought that I might step away from my work for good, because one of the things that I write about in the book is that I actually closed down my business, dismantled everything, stepped away from it all. That's what I was being guided to do. And I, again, being in a place of a lot of unknown where nothing that I was doing was working, at least in the ways that I was used to it happening. And I was open to that, meaning that I wasn't supposed to do this work. And so I walked away from it and I was very open to doing something completely different. I mean, I feel like we hear about that a lot, women in their 40s and 50s reinventing themselves and just moving in an entirely different direction. So I was very open to that. Yet, as I started to move through this, I started to feel called more and more to come back to this work and to do so in different ways, because of course I had grown and changed. And so my body of work grows and changes along with me. But I feel like my creativity, what I put out into the world, is always coming from my own personal experience. So there was definitely a lot that was ready to come forward when I started to reemerge from all this.
And when did your first book come out, Sarah, The Way of the Happy Woman? Was that like 2010 maybe?
That was 2011.
2011. Okay.
Mhm.
Right. So my first book was '06, right? Hip Trinkle Chick. And you think about how our journeys have shifted, right? Since then, since
Yes,
our, because that was your first book, right? It's the first book
that
I know of
was.
for you. Okay.
Yes.
And you just think, like, some of the things I look at and I'm like, "Oh my gosh," how I would say things or do things differently now, and so I'm wondering if for you, you have that too with your first book from 2011.
I still really love that book. I feel like it's a classic. It's like an item in our closet that just can just last through the years and the seasons. Because actually the book is about the seasons and
Mhm.
how we as women need to better flow and flux with the seasons, which now is much more part of the zeitgeist. At that time, it was not so much. So yeah, I still really love that book and I'm glad that I wrote it. And of course, as I go back and I read some of the recipes or things like that, I'm like, oh, this recipe is really outdated. I would because there's new nutritional information that's out. Like I would never make that or never eat that. But otherwise, I feel like the principles in it are really enduring.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I agree, I agree, and I find that the same with mine, and it's funny too, like, I have some listeners who have been with me since they found that book, and apparently, it was on the shelf near "He's Just Not That Into You," and so that's how some people found it, because that was, of course, a very popular book at that time, so isn't that
Right.
funny?
It's funny. And you are really one of the pioneers in the space of women and spirituality and yoga and wellness. Because that was yeah, it was almost 20 years ago now.
A long time, yeah. I did a little 16th birthday party for it, I guess, a couple years ago, just an
Oh,
online
good.
gathering. It's just fun to think of how we've grown since that time, right? And for you to think of how you've grown and to synthesize it too into this book, I think is just so powerful. And so as you think about what's ahead for you, I also like the fact that in midlife, we start thinking a bit more, and legacy might be too strong of a word, but our future and what we see for ourselves and what we want to bring to the world. And I love you sharing how I kind of like not burned things down, but I made some changes and now I'm reemerging and with this rebirth, as you say in the book, or reimagining. And so for you, what would you say has been this journey from these changes, how they've shifted you, and how it is you plan to continue to show up in the world? Because it sounds like you missed your work, you came back to it, but it looks a little different.
Yeah, one of the main things that I'm really focused on is I'm introverted. You could consider me a highly sensitive person. And a lot of times in the past, I was at odds with those dimensions of myself and my work. And I really struggled with finding the right balance. And not to say that I have it all figured out right now, but I feel like I have a much better balance with it in terms of really checking in. Is this really in alignment with me? Is this taking me towards the kind of life that I want to live? There's much more discernment. It's like this concept of if you buy a home and then over the years you're adding on another room and doing all these renovations, but there's not a cohesive plan or feel or vision for the home. I feel like that's how my life and my business were before. Whereas now I started out with a clearer vision, a clearer intention, and then it's more of this path of kind of building that brick by brick. So it's a slower path, and I know it's going to continue to unfold over the next couple of decades for sure. And one of the latest pieces in that, which is part of all of our destinies in midlife, or most of our destinies in midlife, is this summer I realized that I am in a deepened state of perimenopause. And that has called me to make shifts in how I'm eating, when I'm eating, the kind of exercise I'm doing, what my daily schedule is, what kind of breaks that I'm taking. And so I'm in the final season of the year, I'm in this reorganization process and really listening to my body, knowing that it needs some different things and just trying that out. And also really feeling the deeper necessity for more space during this process.
I love the example of the house, right? You just keep adding on, and then you have all these different things, and it's just like, well, what's the cohesion? How do they fit together? And so really being intentional about that. And I do think that fall in particular is just a time of deep reflection. It's like everything in nature at least, like, starts to slow down, right? So how can we emulate that and also do some deep reflection? So I love your seasonal work, and I'd forgotten that the Way of the Happy Woman is definitely focused on that. And now I do think it is much more popular to look at things that way. And what does the season mean to you? What does it look like to you? How can you align with it and really listen to yourself and tune in? So it's very powerful and important work.
Yes, and even looking at midlife as a season in our lives that's similar to fall, that's asking for this slowing down and this deeper introspection. To prepare, I love how, a lot of Asian traditions, I forget the word, I think it's a Japanese word for our equivalent of menopause, but it means second spring. So it's like this work that we do in midlife, this kind of rearranging that happens in our psyches, in our souls, in our lives, and then also in our hormones, just the very ways that our bodies are composed, that's preparing us for this kind of whole new season of our lives that's coming from a place of deeper wisdom.
And so recognizing this, turning 47 and just being like, oh, like I'm really observing and paying attention to these changes. And what would you say are the main things that you notice? I was speaking to somebody earlier this week and she was like, what is midlife? You talk about midlife a lot. Like, how do we know we're in midlife, or what should I expect? She was 40. And I was like, that's a really good question because I don't think I didn't really own midlife till 50. I don't know why. I've clearly been in it for a long time. But how would you describe what you've been experiencing to help listeners even understand more about themselves? Or, oh, could I be noticing that? Or could that be what's going on for me?
Yes, and even though I'm just in the early stages of this, I feel a lot of passion about talking to younger women about being more aware of these changes, and even starting every year to make sure that you're getting a female hormone blood panel test, even starting in your 20s and 30s, and just getting it every year when you get your annual exam so that you can really track where your estrogen levels, where are your progesterone levels, your testosterone levels, your FSH levels. So then when things really start to shift, that they're shifting. And that way, because menopause is actually, it can be like a falling off a cliff of our hormones, and it can catch a lot of women by surprise and be a really, really challenging time. But if we catch it earlier, we can make it easier on ourselves. So, and also not only in current time, but also for future health. Catching it earlier, giving ourselves support earlier helps with longer term bone density and prevention of Alzheimer's and heart health and just so many things. So for me, I just noticed that my baseline was shifting. And last spring was there was a fair amount of stress, as I knew would be with a book launch and other things I had going on in my life, and then just some curveballs thrown in on top of that. And I took the month of August off, which I have started to do for the past couple of years. And my experience in the past is that when I take a week, 2 weeks off, I bounce back. I get a lot of sleep, I do a lot of self-care, and then I'm feeling like myself again. But this year, at the end of four almost 5 weeks off, I was still feeling exhausted. And I realized something's different here. And I'd already been feeling my body telling me, like, I need to move in different ways. I need to eat different things. And it was only when talking with a friend who's in her early 50s, and she was talking about as she started really addressing perimenopause when she was 45, that kind of some light bulb started to go off inside of me. So I think the first thing is just starting to recognize the symptoms of change, and how it doesn't necessarily need to mean that your cycle is changing. Like my cycle hasn't changed yet, but there are these other markers with sleep and mood and things like this that we can start to catch it earlier and see, okay, things are changing. How can I give myself support early on in that change so it doesn't get too challenging further down the line?
And I think too, yes, it's like all the things you just mentioned, and also energy shifts, right? So for you, even just recognizing like, oh, I'm usually regenerated and I feel great when I come back from a sabbatical, but now I'm so tired, right? So checking in with yourself. And I think too, women at this time start having a lot of interrupted sleep and the sleep is a little off. It's not as deep or waking up throughout the night. And so just recognizing, oh, this is part of the process and part of the journey. So how can I make sure I am setting myself up for success by like for me now I go to bed 9, latest 10. I used to be up till 12 or 1 working, like insanity. And I love what you said too about being an HSP and introverted because I am also. So to have those capacities to be on, like, I don't know, to promote your book or things along those lines, it's like it takes a lot out of you. And so you need that recuperation time. And I think when we're younger, we just push through that, right? But now it's like, oh no, mama needs some time off now, right? So
Yes,
recognizing energy is so, it shifts a lot.
for sure. I have another mentor who's in her mid-50s now, and she had told me a few years ago about her journey through menopause and just said, "Do the work now to get your business, get your life set up so that you don't need to be really pedal to the metal." And so I was working more these past few years just to get things more set up, and I thought that I had more time in front of me, like, I thought, I don't think I'm really gonna go through actual menopause for several more years in my early 50s, but I guess I didn't realize that the changes were gonna start earlier than that in such a way that has so much impact. Because disrupted sleep most nights has a huge impact.
Huge. Yeah, absolutely. Well, so tell me too about your physical wellness practices. Like, are you still big into yoga? Are you more doing more yin? Like, what have you noticed as you've aged, your body needs or craves?
I still do yoga most every day, and these days it's a lot of yin. And I have a bio mat, so it's like a heated amethyst mat that's just right over here in my creative space where I do my practice every morning. So I meditate, and usually I'll do some yin yoga, and then if I have more energy, I'll do more of like a slow flow, or once a week I like to just go out and do a class, usually a slow flow class. And then I've also started doing more like Pilates, sculpt, low intensity, just to do some weight bearing to help with bone density. And now, one of my new things that I'm weaving in this season that I had done several years ago, but had fallen away, is just going to the gym and actually lifting heavier weights a couple times a week. And then I walk pretty much every day for about an hour and walk with my dog. And there's so much beautiful nature here in Boulder. I have a beautiful lake right behind my house. So I usually walk around the lake, and it's no high intensity exercise for me. It's just all pretty gentle.
Such a shift. At least it is for me, right? It's been
Yeah.
such a shift from the vinyasa days.
What kind of are you practicing yoga now, or what's your kind of physical care look like?
Yeah, well, I do a lot of ballet now, and I had a hip replacement 2 years ago and then subsequent follow-up surgeries for complications. So now I'm in a phase where I can't do anything for a couple more months, but I am gonna go to a yen class tonight. It might be a little bit of a stretch, so we'll see. But I love yen, and I think I've had one real vinyasa class, like, that was you're a little bit faster when I went to Borneo on a retreat to see orangutans and, like, the facilitator taught it, and I'm like, "You're Jiva Mukti trained, I can tell." And it felt really good, but it's stuff I haven't done with my body in years, like
Yeah.
headstand or pigeon, but it felt really nice to be back, but I don't think that my body's really capable of that anymore, especially just with some injuries and limitations. So now I'm really, really drawn to I love ballet, I love the flow and beauty of that practice now.
Right. I was a ballerina for a lot of my life until
Ah.
around age 20. And I keep I keep thinking I actually I bought a new leotard and tights and skirt last summer, but I still haven't gone to a class. So it's gonna happen one of these days.
Well, you know what I found in 2020, right when everything went online? I started doing daily ballet practices versus like 15-minute commute up to Washington Ballet, taking a class, commuting back. Not that that's that far, but it's a lot of shifting. And now I just open the computer and I do a lot of online live classes, but from the comfort of my own home. And there's something
Mm,
about not being in a bright studio with big mirrors and other
yeah.
people that I find really just like, especially for an introvert, it's just very grounding. So I'd be happy to share those
Yeah,
studios
I'd
with
love to
you.
get those from you.
Yeah. Well, so before we close, like, could you have any final thoughts of wisdom or little nuggets that you'd like to share with our listeners about your kind of journey into midlife and what you've recognized and noticed and paid attention to, which I think you've touched on so many of that, but anything we may have missed?
Well, I think one thing that may help to tie it all together is I mentioned what I'm experiencing now is moving and creating from a place of deeper wholeness in myself. And that I have been able to do that through the support of IFS. And so, what that looks like on a daily basis is just checking in with my parts and seeing, and our parts talk to us through our bodies, through injuries that we have, or sensations in our bodies, or they talk to us through our feelings, through thoughts in our minds, through internal messages. And so I just take time to see each day, like what parts of me are really up right now, and what can I do to support these parts so that I can help them to even just step aside just a little bit so that I can be the one, so that my wisdom can be the wisdom that's guiding the day, and that these parts know that I'm here with them. Because that's the most important thing, is like our parts just want to know that we see them, that we hear them, just like we want that in our relationships, our friendships, our intimate connections. So it's that in and of itself requires moving more slowly. Like even in my work, like not bulldozing through things, but really slowing down and seeing, okay, who's driving the bus right now? Is it a part of me that's afraid, or that's being driven by scarcity, or afraid of being judged, or whatever it is? Like, can I slow it down to give these parts what they need to help them step back so that the real me can step forward?
Beautiful. Thank you. It's such a good reminder. And I just wonder too, like just to follow up to that question is how have you learned to strip away to really see your capital S self, right? It's hard to release the noise. And so I'm curious if you found something in addition to parts work, right, that's been really useful for you.
Well, first, I want to normalize that we're going to blend with our parts and then unblend with them. And it's just like meditation. Meditation isn't about just having a still mind. It's just about being aware of what's happening with compassion and starting over when we forget. And IFS is the same way. So I think it's just really tuning into what are the things that help me to feel really rooted in myself. And yoga's, all the things that I named help with that. Yoga helps with that. Walks outside help with that. Sleep helps with that. Moving more slowly. And I think that's the root of it, is just moving more slowly.
Yeah, such a great reminder. And my last question is always, how do you find tranquility in your everyday? Since that's the name of the podcast, but I think you've just described it.
I think so. Yeah, and those are the things that work for me. But Kimberly, like you said, ballet is a huge piece of that for you. And so I think it's important for all of us just to see, like, what are the things that make me feel connected to myself, that really spark joy in my heart, and how can I give myself those things more often?
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's such a treat to see you again.
Likewise.